Hey folks, so thanks for tuning in. In this short series of videos we're going to go over a seismic retrofit from start to finish. I'm a homeowner and after doing a lot of research I decided to take this project on myself with the help of a friend, and Paul, who's in these videos, who gave me a lot of advice along the way as to how to get the materials, how to actually do the details of the construction and deal with the City of Oakland. So hopefully this video will be, or this series of videos will be really useful for some of those folks out there who are thinking about doing this work, perhaps don't have the expertise or the sort of confidence to do it. Or perhaps if you're just thinking about hiring a contractor, it'll give you some of the advice and information that will help you make sure you choose the right contractor and make sure the work's done properly. Apologise up front for the production quality of these videos. It's kind of challenging filming down in the crawl space. And I'm still getting used to this whole thing of putting videos on YouTube, but hopefully this is really useful. I definitely got a lot of value out of some of the videos on YouTube from Howard Cook and some of the other people out there, but couldn't find anything that was really comprehensive and went into the details of actually doing the work. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments. I've got a lot of stuff that wasn't shared in the actual videos, so do feel free to reach out if you have any questions about doing the plans, dealing with the City of Oakland, special inspections, any of the tools, nails, etc., etc. Just reach out in the comments and I'll be happy to reply. So enjoy watching and thanks very much.
Hi, my name is Paul Root. For some years I was a general contractor here in the San Francisco Bay Area doing a lot of seismic work, and then for other years I was a home inspector helping home buyers understand the trouble they were getting into. Today, Francis and I are going to talk about what to do about ensuring that older homes are protected against collapse in case of an earthquake. If you are living anywhere on the west coast of the United States, or for that matter anywhere along the Pacific Rim, you're probably aware that we are subject to violent earthquakes. And most of our housing stock, especially in the inner cities, is old. Mostly in our area is almost all installed before the 1930s, and a lot of it goes back even to the 19th century. And they weren't really designing for seismic resistance at that time. So we have to do some work to upgrade the home for seismic resistance. We usually call that a retrofit, which just means that we're going back and adding something to the house. Now, if you're wondering whether your home might need a retrofit, well, the first question is, how old is it? And the older it is, the more chance that answer is yes. If it's older than, let's say, before World War II, almost certainly it could benefit from at least some retrofit work. If it's older than, let's say, 1930, then absolutely, unless there's something very unusual about it. And even quite a few newer homes, even up until just 20 years ago, weren't really properly designed by what we now know are the proper standards, so they can benefit from some additional work also. But let's say, for sake of argument here, we're looking at Francis's house, and this dates from what, Francis, 1912?
1912, yeah.
1912. Well, this is typical of a lot of homes in our area. And, I can tell just by looking at it from the street that unless someone has already done some seismic work, that it's going to need a retrofit. How do I know that? Well, first of all, just by the age, of course. And also, I can tell by looking at it that it has a crawl space and a cripple wall. And you can tell that by looking at the entry, that you see there's several steps up, but it's not a full story up. So there's a partial story that's under the main floor. We're going to see some more of this here in a little bit. But that little section of wall that goes between the ground and the main floor is called a cripple wall. And that's one of the main points of weakness in these older homes. So when you see that, then you start looking to see if a retrofit has been done. If it hasn't, then it's time to start thinking about it.
So Paul, let's take a look under the house.
Good deal. Well, this house is an easy one to look at because it has a fair amount of space and pretty good access. In many cases, these crawl spaces are a lot lower and you have to crawl on your belly to get under there. So far we're ahead of the game. We're going to go under here and take a look. So in this case, we have a situation where Francis has already done a lot of the work, but we can see both the areas where he's worked on and some of the areas where he hasn't. So we can look at both the old and the new, which kind of helps us understand, how the system works. Again, just to point out the basics, like most older houses, or even many newer houses, the house has a perimeter concrete foundation. This is the concrete here. This is an older type of foundation. It doesn't have reinforcing steel in it, but still it's in pretty good condition, and is certainly adequate to anchor the house down to it. And the foundation runs all around the outer rim of the house. In newer homes, often there are intermediate footings, sometimes going from front to back. But like a lot of older homes, this only has a perimeter foundation. But that's fine, that's the key point. We need to reinforce the perimeter walls. So here's the foundation. And then these older homes are built on in a certain pattern that we often call Western framing, meaning the Western United States. And it starts here on top of the foundation with a board that lays flat. This is called the mud sill, because it's close to the mud, I guess. Anyway, these old mud sills are usually made of very high quality redwood, which back in 1912 was being cut out of 2,000-year-old redwood trees. And it's extremely high quality and very durable. So as long as it hasn't deteriorated, it's a very good material, and we can use it as part of our anchoring system. Then starting up from here, we have this area, the distance between the foundation and the floor. This is called the cripple wall. Cripple simply means it's short, shorter than a normal wall. That's all it means. And that the wall is made, and we're going to shift down here to an area where some of the original framing is still visible. Climb over these.
I've been doing some digging there.
I like it, okay. Variety. Okay, we're going to get down to here where we can see the original framing. Then again, starting with the foundation and the mud sill, and here you can see the whole mud sill. Then there's the vertical structure is what are called studs. These are vertical pieces, and in this case, they're going from the mud sill up to what's called a top plate in the wall. It's called a top plate because it's on top, and then the floor framing for the main floor rests on top of that. So the weakness of the older homes is mainly in these cripple walls, because without plywood on them or any other significant bracing, in a powerful quake, the quake will just push the house back and forth, actually, and the framing really has very little resistance to that. So what can happen after it gets pushed back and forth a few times, or maybe a few hundred times in a strong earthquake, it can collapse. And so it'll go one way or the other, either out this way or out that way. But then what used to be your main floor is now on the ground, and your house is basically wrecked. In many cases, if not most cases, that can mean total loss of the structure. But it just wouldn't be cost effective to put it back together. You'd have to tear it down and start over. That's a huge loss, obviously. So can you prevent that? Yes. So the main method by which we prevent these walls from tipping over like that is by installing plywood bracing. And this bracing, even though the plywood itself it's only half an inch thick, but that's fine. It's installed, securely nailed to the framing, to the top plate. It's secured to the mud sill. And a wall like this can withstand a tremendous amount of pressure. In most cases, these can withstand several hundred pounds of pressure in this direction, per foot of wall. So if you have 10 feet of it, then you're talking about several thousand pounds it can resist. And there are formulas you can use to figure out how much of the bracing you would need to compensate for the overall weight of the house. But for a home like this, it's relatively simple. More or less, it's a rectangle. It's not real big. It's just one story. You can kind of parse it out by rule of thumb. In most cases, you're going to end up wanting, at least 16 feet or sometimes 12 feet on the narrower walls, and more than that, sometimes double that on the alternate walls. So anyway, Francis has got this ready to go here, and you can see the key elements of the bracing panel. This is called a shear panel often, or bracing panel, or the plywood itself. And notice the key thing is the nailing. This is nailed, at very close spacing at all of the edges, including to the mud sill on the top plate and along the outer studs. In the center studs, the nailing's further apart because it doesn't get as much pressure there. That's not as critical. It's mainly the outer section. And there are anchor bolts here. We can't see them in here now. But there are anchor bolts behind the plywood, and here's one here that you can see. This has been added. The older homes of this era generally did not have any kind of anchoring. Basically, it was just the framing and the house was sitting on the foundation simply by gravity. Well, it doesn't take much imagination to see how the house could be pushed off the foundation, under enough stress. So here's a typical modern foundation anchor. This is a 5/8 inch diameter, what's called all thread. In other words, it's a piece of steel that's threaded all the way from top to bottom. And then Francis has cut these pieces off and made them long enough so they can go at least 7 inches into the concrete. And he cleaned the holes out, and then he's filled that hole with an epoxy grouting cement, stuffed the anchor in there with its this plate, which is called a base plate or base washer, and then put the nut on it. So this can resist a tremendous amount of force, and so he's done this all around the perimeter. So that takes care of what was an original weakness of not being anchored at all. I do want to mention that a lot of homes newer than 1912, even up into the 1970s in some cases, will have some anchors, but they're often not good enough. Starting really in the late 1930s and increasingly after that, the builders would use various kinds of anchors. Sometimes they would just use pieces of rebar steel stuck through the mud sill and bent over at the top. Other times they would start using big screws, or else anchor bolts that weren't big enough, like little 1/2 inch bolts, or even smaller ones in some cases. And those will deteriorate. They'll rust off inside the concrete, so they're not useful. So if you have a house that has those, the best thing is just ignore them and just start over putting your anchors in. As long as you have access in here, it's really not that hard to do this. Isn't that right, Francis? You find it?
Yeah. After getting to grips with the work that needed to be done, it really wasn't too difficult.
Piece of cake.
Yeah.
Piece of cake. So anyway, these are the anchors. So now the mud sill's anchored down to the foundation, which means that the rest of the structure is anchored down. And then at the shear panels, we need some special hardware. And this is what's called a hold down. And this has a deeper bolt here, and this is a manufactured product that's engineered for this purpose, and it has special screws in here that fasten it to the framing. And the purpose of this is to prevent the shear panel from being lifted this way and tipping on end, under strong pressure. And these are used in most modern seismic systems. Anytime you have a shear panel that is more than about 50% taller than the width. So if I'm not saying that right. In other words, if this were only 2 feet tall and this were at least 4 feet long, then you wouldn't need this. But in most cases where you have a taller wall like this, yeah, you do need it because of the potential for uplift. And then Francis has also drilled some holes in here for ventilation. And these are in between the studs. The purpose of this is just to make sure that if there's moisture that gets in behind here, which probably there will be, at least to a certain extent, that it has a way to dry out. Because you don't, after going to all this trouble, you don't want your work to be ruined, by wood rot or excess moisture. So this helps keep it ventilated, help prevent that. Then the last element up here, what we have here are transfer ties. These are the different kinds of hardware designed for this purpose. This is an H10, isn't that what this is?
Yeah, it's an H10.
And these are used to make sure that the forces in the floor are transferred down into the shear panel and then into the foundation. And one kind of counterintuitive factor about this seismic work is that the forces actually accumulate from the top of the house to the bottom. You know, you think of an earthquake as moving the ground, and so you would think, well, the forces start at the ground. No, not really. One way it's been explained to me is if you think about standing in the back of a pickup truck and then the driver suddenly puts on the gas, you move like this. Wow. So the house acts the same way. The ground moves, but the first part of the house responds at the top, actually, and it starts going back and forth. And as that force comes down through the house, you know, it has to have a path, you know, what's called load path, or a means of resisting that force, or else it'll fail. And in a single-story home like this, you know, the main, once you get above the cripple wall, the main structure you have that will resist that kind of movement is the floor. And, you know, the subfloor, in this case, consists of boards. You know, each of these has at least 2 nails, you know, per joist. So there are a zillion nails in this framing. So this whole system here constitutes what we call a diaphragm. It's a large square or more or less rectangular structure with 1 million nails in it that will resist a tremendous amount of force, just like the shear panel does. So the forces can come down through the walls, into the floor framing, into the shear panel, and down to the foundation, and into the soil where it goes away.
So Paul, what would you say to homeowners and whether they can tackle this kind of job themselves?
Well, there are a lot of things to consider. First point is, do you have time? I mean, in a house like this, what it'd take you, what the equivalent of?
It took about 7 days with
okay,
me and a friend with the right tools.
A week of your time with a friend and the tools. You know, if you can spare that time, it's well worth the time, and the payoff is pretty good. Because I would guess the materials you used in here probably didn't cost more than, what, $1,500 maybe?
Yeah, about that, maybe $2,000.
So if you hired a professional to come here and do this, I would say it's at least $10,000.
Right.
So you're getting paid pretty well, you know, for your sweat equity. So if you have the time to do it, and if you don't mind coming into a crawl space like this, you know, you might get dirty, you might be afraid of the dark. If things like that bother you, then it's probably not a job for you. But if you have access, if you can tolerate getting dirty, of course you can wear some coveralls, you wear gloves, you wear other personal protection, and if you're okay with that, then you've got that point covered. Then it's you know, are you familiar with working with tools? If you have some carpentry experience, that's very valuable. At least if you know how to use a power saw, you know how to use a drill. Or if you don't, you can get some instruction you know, on the internet, or ask someone to help you who knows more about it. You do need to study these things carefully, because there are some hazards involved. I mean, when you're using a power saw, if you don't know what you're doing, you can cut your fingers off. That's bad. And you can hurt yourself in a lot of different ways. So you want to use a personal protection. You want to make sure you're following the instructions for the tool. If you're not sure, get someone to help you. But none of this is all that complicated. It doesn't require a whole lot of personal strength or anything. Then the next questions come up, well, how complicated is it going to be? You know, if your home is relatively simple like this one, where the outline is more or less a rectangle, and especially if it's just a single story, chances are good that you can do a pretty good job by yourself or with maybe a friend helping you. The points you want to consider that make it more complicated, you know, there are a number of them. First of all, you want to take a look at the foundation, and you know, you can do this yourself. You know, if you have an old foundation that sort of looks like this and it looks okay, all right, fine. Well, then get a big screwdriver and go along, see if you find any points that are soft. I mean, if you can put a screwdriver into it somewhere, you know, by twisting a screwdriver and it goes in an inch or two, well, that's a red flag. And if you have a lot of that at the perimeter of the house, you know, then you may have a foundation problem. And that's time when you need to start talking to an engineer about, do you need a new foundation or perhaps a partial new foundation? Because obviously if you anchor the building into concrete that's crumbly or it's not competent, you know, you're wasting your time. So there's that. I would say in probably 90% of the cases that turns out not to be a problem, but there are exceptions. The other thing, if the house is a complicated design, complicated shape, you know, maybe not a rectangle, maybe it's an octagon, you know, or maybe it's had additions on it so that it has parts that protrude in various ways, and you know, there's no clear rectilinear design to it. You know, that's something that usually needs engineering. Another big one is if it's on a hillside, more than just a slight slope, I'd say more than about a 15% grade, you should get an engineer involved, because homes like that require special methods. And especially if you're on a steep hillside, and let's say part of the house is 1 story, part of the house is 2 story, or maybe it's even 4 stories on the downhill side and 1 story on the uphill side. You know, there are a lot of homes like that. Those need to be engineered, and usually the work gets to be more complicated, and it's usually beyond the capacity of an individual homeowner. That doesn't mean you don't play a role, though. Obviously, you're going to have to decide who to hire, and you can perhaps do some of the work yourself, and you work with a contractor to see, you know, what that might be. Anyway, those are factors I would say would rule out doing it yourself. But in this case, you can see it certainly is possible for a homeowner to do the work on a typical older home like this. And I would say this house is now many times more resistant to earthquake damage than it was originally. And it's also undoubtedly many times more resistant and therefore safer than almost all of the other homes in the neighborhood. Because we know that actually very few homes in these older areas have really been adequately retrofitted. I know that in some local jurisdictions, the authorities will say, well, we know that 20% of the homes have been retrofitted. Well, maybe they have, maybe they haven't. As a home inspector, I saw numerous homes where supposedly somebody had done some retrofit work, but I could just tell right away it wasn't good enough. You know, they used the wrong kind of plywood, it wasn't nailed properly, there are just big gaps or other problems that basically just eliminate the value of it. So, yeah, in this case, we don't have that. You know, Francis has done his homework, he's done a good job here. And so his home is realistically quite a lot more resistant to earthquakes, whereas other homes in the neighborhood, who knows?
Yeah, that's good to hear.
Francis, maybe your house will still be standing. All the other ones are knocked down. I don't know whether that's good or bad. You know.
Well, I certainly hope it'll be standing for the next 100 years.
Well, that's good. I don't think I'll be standing for the next 100 years. But
me neither.
Yeah. So, other questions? Other things that maybe you would suggest to a homeowner that we haven't talked about?
Well, so one issue with this house was that the cripple wall was just over 4 foot at the back here, which meant that I had to get an engineer to come and do the designs. So maybe you could talk a little bit about Plan Set A, you know, what that is.
Right. Plan Set A is a set of one-size-fits-all plans that has been adopted in many parts of California. I don't know about other parts of the U.S., but in houses that meet the standards for that, in other words, the cripple walls aren't more than 4 feet tall and the house is more or less rectangular or a single story, then you can go to the building department and you can say, well, I want to do a retrofit and I'd like to use Plan Set A, and they'll give you a set of the plans. And those plans will show you how the plywood's installed and what kind of anchors to use. It's fairly comprehensive, and it's I would say about 85% good. Where you do run into problems is where you do have walls that are taller than 4 feet. Then technically you can't use that set of plans. Although in fact, you're not really going to do anything different until you get up to, I mean, if you have walls that are 7, 8, 9 feet tall, then that's another story. But if they're just slightly taller, the difference is really minimal.
Yeah, I'll say in this case, I studied Plan Set A. I actually made some Plan Set A plans for this house before.
Yeah.
I realized I needed to get an engineer. And the main difference was we have a bit more plywood than the plan set A would have required.
Right, right.
And we have the hold downs at the ends of each shear panel.
Right, right.
But that's really the only difference.
Right, okay. Well, that brings up the question of the role of the building department. One thing is kind of hard for us to get our minds around, at least I'll speak for myself. I have never understood it. We have known since 1906, in our area, that there's a potential for powerful earthquakes that can wreck structures and kill people and cause all kinds of problems. However, even now, there still is no actual building code for retrofitting an existing building. The new building codes have standards for seismic resistance that are to be built into new structures, and those are quite rigorous. But still, there's no code for upgrading an older structure. So, then what's the role of the building department? They don't really have a code to enforce. Well, what can they do? Well, they can, if you're using Plan Set A, they can verify that the house qualifies for that, and they can look in and see, well, it looks like you did it properly. Or if there's a set of engineered plans, then they can look at that and see if you followed the plans. Unfortunately, you have to realize that the building department is made up of bureaucrats. And like all bureaucrats, they want to avoid doing any more work than is absolutely necessary. Their main job is to create paperwork and jobs for other bureaucrats. And I've seen municipal inspectors approve work that was just clearly substandard. I mean, I could just tell from the street that it was substandard, and they sign off on it anyway, because maybe they're too busy. They certainly don't want to crawl into the house. They'll almost never do that. Almost never. Once in a while they will, but almost very rarely. And if they do go into, they don't really look carefully. Like if Francis had omitted these top pieces of hardware here, would the building department notice? Gee, who knows? I'd be surprised if they did, but yeah, they might. And would they notice if he missed the nails in some places? Probably not. So, you can't really rely on them for quality control. So that said, it's sort of a judgment call, sort of a personal ethical question as to whether you should just bypass the permit process altogether. And in a case like this, Francis could easily have done that and would have saved himself quite a bit of money. But now, at least he had this signed off by the city, so if he decides to sell the house 10 years from now, it is a selling point to be able to say, we did this seismic retrofit and it was approved by the city. Whether it really means anything or not, hard to say, but it is a selling point. If you get into more complicated work, multi-story buildings and foundation replacement and more complicated things like that, then you pretty much have to get the building department involved. Because for one thing, they're going to see it from the street, see that something's going on, and then they're going to want to know what you're doing. Anyway, that's my take on it.
Yeah, I would say, we had to do this with permits because we got the East Bay Bolt and Brace grant.
Right, right.
And that was a requirement. And yeah, they came out 3 times. Actually had to get some special inspections done for the nailing and the epoxy anchors. So it added a lot of time and cost to the project for sure.
So did you recoup enough by doing it yourself to pay for the extra expense of getting the state grant and paying the building department and paying engineering and all that?
I'll say the grant pretty much covered the cost of the permit, the special inspections, and the engineered plans.
Okay, so
and everything else was out of my own pocket, the materials and the labor.
Right, right. Okay. Well, your labor was cheap, so
yeah.
You're ahead of the game.
Yeah.
I've often told people that when it comes to sweat equity, if you're in a situation where you can do a good job on a retrofit and do the work yourself, it's one of the best paid sweat equity projects that you can do. You have to be careful, but it ain't rocket science.
Right.
You can do it, and it's a huge improvement.
Yeah.
And as I said, it's also a selling point, if you decide later to sell the house, because people are becoming more and more concerned about that. And if you can assure them that you did properly designed work, well, that helps quite a bit.
So before going into the details of the actual work, I wanted to just give you some background here and show you some of the work that we had to do up front to get this project going. So this house is a 1912 Craftsman house, single-story wooden frame construction on a concrete perimeter foundation with a crawl space. And you know, of course, we've spent a lot of money on this house so far. So we have a lot invested in it, and of course in California there are earthquakes, and we're expecting a big one at some point fairly soon. So it seemed like a really sensible thing to do a seismic retrofit, you know, with the benefits of it helping strengthen your house, so if there is an earthquake, hopefully it won't fall off the foundation, topple over, or have some sort of catastrophic damage that will require it to be torn down, which has definitely happened with houses in the past. So, you know, we'd heard that for this kind of house it could cost around $10,000, perhaps a little bit more. So we thought it was something worth doing. And we looked around, we actually found this thing called East Bay Bolt and Brace Program, which is a lottery run by the state of California, and it gives you $3,000 towards the cost of your retrofit. So we applied. You have to meet certain criteria. Definitely look on their website to figure out whether you qualify. But we were lucky enough to win it, and we haven't got the money yet, but it allows you to claim back up to $3,000 in expenses, and this project's definitely cost over that. So, you know, we'll fingers crossed get $3,000 back towards the costs, which is definitely a help. So the first thing to do with this retrofit was really figure out what work needed to be done. And so, you know, I started off with this plan set A, which is this prescriptive off-the-shelf design for retrofits where you don't need an engineer. But I quickly figured out that the cripple wall at the back of the house here, which is this area on the design, is over 4 foot in height. And that means that in order to get a permit, you need to have an engineered design. And so, you know, I searched around for an engineer and managed to find this guy called Dan Sumsky, who I definitely recommend. And he created these designs for us. And as you can see, he's mapped out the internal layout of the house, the sort of foundation layout, and you can see various details here. So we've got a chimney down here, we've got the porch, we've got the back entrance, and these things here are the shear wall panels that he's proposing that we put in. So several throughout the perimeter of the house. And these HDU2s are hold downs, so those are the metal brackets that help hold those shear walls down and stop them from overturning in the event of an earthquake. And so that's one of the first details. Here we've got some details on the posts, the piers and posts, on the inside of the foundation, on the inside of the cripple, the crawl space. Some details of how the construction should be done. Some calculations that are required from the engineer, and also details on how the plywood should be nailed to the studs. So all of that's really handy. Of course, you know, you need to follow these designs as you do the work. But this allowed us to get a permit from the city of Oakland. That cost $427. Actually, I'm going to share all of the details of the costs and you know, the materials in the description of this video below. So do check that out. Hopefully that gives you a better idea of you know, what's required. But once we got the permit, we could start on the work. And so in the next few videos, that's what I'm going to be showing you. How you go about doing this kind of work, you know, what materials you need, what tools you need, and how the work is actually done. So I wanted to talk through some of the tools that we used for the retrofit. Got most of them laid out here. Number one, safety first. So definitely invest in one of these respirators. Don't bother with the flimsier ones that you just sort of put over your face and over your nose with the metal clip. Definitely get one of these. They're not too expensive and you can change the filters quite easily. Safety goggles, of course, and the gloves that I'm wearing, these were great. So starting off with the holes, we used this rotary hammer to drill the holes. Actually we used a normal drill to drill holes in the wood first with a speed bit, and then we use this to drill through the concrete. And this did a really excellent job. It's quite compact, so it's easy to get in the stud bays with, even if there's limited height. And as you can see, it's got an SDS Plus bit on the end here. This is a 3/4 inch bit, because you have to drill the holes 1/8 of an inch wider than the actual threaded bolt. And it's got this guide here for the depth. We actually didn't end up using that, sort of got in the way, and this too. But that was a really useful tool, about $300 for the bare tool plus the batteries. Here we've got our bolts. This is a hot dip galvanized 5/8 of an inch bolt, all thread, so threaded all the way through with a nut on the end. And we actually cut these from a longer length with a chop saw. That saved a lot of money. This is a slightly narrower bit, a 5/8 bit for some of the smaller holes that we made for the piers. Here we've got the epoxy nozzle, so this is used to mix the set XP, the two parts of the cartridge, and use that to put it into the holes. These two things here are used for cleaning out the holes. So this is just a sort of air gun attachment for your air compressor. Did a really good job, nice long nozzle on the end, so you can get right to the bottom of the hole and blow out. And definitely recommend vacuuming the hole beforehand. Make sure you're wearing your safety protection when you use this, and you put it in the hole, sort of hold it for 3 seconds, a minimum of 80 psi, and it does a really good job of cleaning out that hole. Make sure your face isn't above the hole when you do that, because it'll go in your face and it won't be a nice experience. After you've used the air, and actually use the air afterwards as well, but use this cleaning brush to clean out the holes. This is a Simpson one, costs about $5-6, but definitely a required part of the procedure. Over here we've got some nail guns. So this one on the left here, the Hitachi NR90, is a framing nailer, and this was used for the blocking and also for the shear wall nailing. Never used a nail gun before, but made sure I got familiar with it before I used it. And the safety features, of course you have to wear safety goggles when using a nail gun. You know, I wasn't confident enough to use it without the safety catch, so in order to activate it without the safety catch, this has to be depressed on your surface and then you pull the trigger. But that did a really good job, as did this little tool here, the palm nailer. So this is really one of the best $35 I've spent in my life. A really great tool. Basically you just put your nail in the end there, or if your nail's already inserted partly, you just put that onto the end of the nail, apply a little bit of pressure, and it will continually hammer it in until you're happy. And it's really useful for getting in those tight spaces where you can't swing a hammer, or you can't get this larger framing hammer in there. So I use this a lot, and I think I'm going to use this a lot in the future too. Here we've got some saws. So the miter saw, super useful for cutting your 2x4s to length. Didn't really need to do any miter cuts, but you can use it for that too. This is a circular saw, so again use that for cutting some of the 2x4s or 2x6s, but particularly for cutting the plywood. That was super useful. Make sure you got a decent blade on there. This one was particularly designed for plywood, and it did a really good job. So over here we have the air compressor. This is about $100, and it was really perfect for this job. 6 gallons, 150 psi, and had no problems powering the nail gun over there. Of course it did have to cycle quite a lot as we were nailing, but didn't really have a problem keeping up. So recommend that. And this is a polyurethane hose, $20 on Amazon from Hitachi, and 25 foot. So that did a good job too. Doesn't seem to tangle too much, although it looks pretty bad there. This over here is an oscillating tool. So we use this to do some of our flush cuts with the mudsill. Took a bit of time. We also used the Sawzall with a long blade on it to try and get those mudsills flush. But a really useful tool for all sorts of things actually. Finally, some of the resources that were helpful with the project. This book, written by a guy called Thor Matheson, based here in Berkeley, is a really useful guide. You know, has a lot of the common mistakes, some pictures which are really helpful and hard to find online. So recommend that book. That's available on Amazon. Paul also recommended I get these brochures from Simpson. You can order them online. They're entirely free, and they'll send them to you pretty quick. And they actually have the Seismic retrofit guide that has a lot of information, a lot of designs and sort of basic information in there that's useful. And they have these product catalogs that help you figure out exactly what fixtures, what hardware you're going to need. They also give you a bit of information on how to install that hardware, what nails to use, for example. So super useful and free. Of course, you end up paying a lot for the Simpson hardware, but that's beside the point. And yeah, here are my engineered designs, and that's pretty much it in terms of tools. You know, all of this stuff did probably cost at least $1,000, perhaps a little bit more in total, but you know, I can either keep some of this stuff and use it for other projects, or perhaps sell it. It's all in pretty good condition, and recoup some of that money. Finally, here we have some of the nails. Of course, with engineered designs, nails are really important because they specify exactly which ones you need to use. And in general, actually, with seismic work, you need to make sure that you're using the right kinds of nails. And so make sure you get the right ones for your nail gun. These are plastic collated, which I understand you know, you can get them wet and they're not going to disintegrate. These are 21-degree angle, this angle here, so they'll load into this nail gun pretty easily. And that's about it. So I wanted to give you a quick update on how we've been getting on with the retrofit. Today's been a pretty hard day of work, and we managed to get a lot of stuff accomplished. So today was really working on the anchor holes. So the first thing I did was actually to plan out exactly where they were going to be, and so we'd already mapped out where the sheets, the shear walls, are going to go, and therefore the double studs at each end and the hold downs. And our plans actually ask for anchors at a minimum of 3 foot on center. So I started here. This is a double stud here, and there's going to be a shear wall all across this back wall here, and so there's an anchor bolt there, and we were careful to make sure that that fits with where the hold down is going to sit, just above that anchor bolt. So this is the hold down here, and our plan specified that the top of the HDU2 needs to be a minimum of 13 inches from the top of the concrete there. So the anchor is going to go through there, it's going to go through the mud sill, through the block, and up into this hold down where it will be secured down. And so the next bolt is here, which is probably around 3 feet, and one over here, another one over there. And one of the things that I didn't realize was there are actually some obstructions. So certainly on the side of the house, which is a bit lower, it's difficult to get into some of the spaces, particularly where you have these cross beams coming across. So what I've done is actually I've put some of the bolts a bit closer to each other, so I can avoid having to work in some of those tight spaces. So that's the end of the shear wall here, a double stud there, and this side is just going to be bolted, no shear wall. So there's a hole in there, another hole there, another one there. And so what we did here was, and I'll show this in another video, I first of all pre-drilled the mud sill with a 3/4 inch speed drill bit, and I'm using 5/8 of an inch bolts, anchor bolts, and they recommend adding 1/4 of an inch to the width of your drill bit to accommodate for them. So first of all, drilled through the mud sill, and then once that was done, started drilling with the hammer drill, the rotary hammer, through the concrete. And these anchors that are outside of shear walls are 7 inches in embedment in the concrete, as are the ones within the shear wall, but the hold downs are 8 inches embedment in the concrete. So that was something to be mindful of. My drill bit was just on the edge of being able to get down 8 inches with the mud sill. So we're careful to check that we got the required depth with just a stick that we used, that we marked, that we could put in the hole. So these are waiting now to be cleaned out, and that's the job for tomorrow. The way we're going to do that is, as it's specified on the Set XP instructions that are actually written on the tubes. So you blow out the hole with 80 psi of compressed air for 4 seconds. Then you have a brush that you use, you turn it 4 times, and then you use some compressed air again for 4 seconds, and then it should be clean. So that's what we're going to do tomorrow. So that's pretty much it for now. There are about 60 anchor bolts or holes that we had to drill today. So quite a bit of work, but wasn't too hard. Thankfully we had a good drill. Actually the drill bit gave in at the end of the day. The end of it actually snapped off. So we've got about 5 more to do. but the DeWalt battery-powered hammer drill, rotary hammer that I bought, actually did the job really well, and it's quite compact, so certainly at the front of the house it was easy to get in and do the required work in some of those tighter stud bays. So that's it for today, and we'll keep you up to date on the progress. So today we started off by setting all of the anchors in epoxy, and our plan specified Set XP, which is a Simpson strong tie product. Here you can see it. This is the dual cartridge that we used. You can see the nozzle is coated in the epoxy that we used. This is one of the clean nozzles. What I didn't realize was Home Depot, they sell it without the nozzle. The other local lumber shop that I went to, Truett and White, sell the exact same product, but it comes with a nozzle each one, and it's actually cheaper. So that saved a lot of money, because Home Depot sell these nozzles for $20 each. This little tip goes on the end of the nozzle if you need to get in a slightly more narrow hole, like we did with these ones, which are a 1/2 inch bolt and a 5/8 hole. So this is the dispenser. I was planning on getting one of these from the tool library, but they were closed yesterday, so I had to buy this one from Truett and White, $50, which is about $20 cheaper than Home Depot. Works pretty well. I will say that after doing about 70 anchors in total, or perhaps a little bit more, my hand was pretty worn out. I've got a big blister on my thumb. Apparently you can get ones that are air actuated or battery powered, so perhaps if I was doing this as a day job, I might get one of those. So the special inspection, which is required by the City of Oakland for these epoxy anchors, was pretty straightforward. We had everything sort of prepared, the holes were drilled, cleaned, we'd cut all of the bolts, and we put the bolts into each of the holes so we knew which bolt was going where. The hold downs, of course, are a little bit longer. The bolts that go through extra blocking are a little bit longer, and then the ones that just go through the mud sill are a little bit shorter. And then these ones here, the embedment was 6 inches into concrete, and it's a 1/2 inch bolt. Over there, the ones between shear walls and sort of outside of shear walls are 7 inches embedment in concrete, and the hold downs are 8 inches embedment in concrete. So applying the epoxy is pretty straightforward. You just sort of break open the cartridge, start a new nozzle if you need to, or you can reuse the nozzle. We used 7 lots of these for about 70 anchor bolts here. So I was able to return some of those, get some money back, because they're about $40 each. When you start a new pack, you need to sort of squeeze it through so it's properly mixed, and it should look pretty consistent grey. Once you get that, you can then start applying it to the hole. Start at the bottom. It's actually quite difficult to know how much you put in, I found. So you can squeeze, pull up and push down, and you'll start feeling a sponginess, and you can begin to feel the level of epoxy in the hole. And I read that you're supposed to put around 2/3, fill the hole to about 2/3 full. So that's about what we did. Some of them had a bit of epoxy coming out of the top, not really a problem. Just smooth that out after I'd put it in, so it doesn't dry and sort of create a obstruction to your washer. And as you're applying, so you sort of put the epoxy in, you then put your bolt in and twist the bolt as you're putting it in, so it gets the threads nice and coated, so it has a good strong adhesion. And then what we actually did was we put the washers and nuts on, so they're ready to be tightened tomorrow. And Set XP has a 24-hour cure time at, I believe, 21 degrees Celsius, which here in California, in Oakland, It probably is, if not a little bit higher. So we should be ready to go tomorrow. Tighten these down, install the hold downs, finish up with some of the hardware here. So we've been putting these T-straps in, the L90s in the corners here. So let me just show you one of those. So you've got the top plate here, you've got the end joist there, and so we're going to have an L90 in the corner there and one at the top. So those are going to be nailed in. Other than that, we've got a few other smaller jobs to finish off. I've actually got to remove a copper pipe to allow us to get in one block, so we can then put the shear wall on top and reattach that. Otherwise, we've pretty much been able to avoid most of the obstructions. So that's the latest update, and we'll let you know how we get on next. In terms of inspections, we had the first rough inspection from City of Oakland, who basically saw our holes and some of the blocking that we put in, gave us the okay to proceed to the epoxy special inspection, which we had this morning. The next inspection, another rough inspection from the City of Oakland, is just going to be to check all of the blocking and framing, and just give us the okay to then close up. So we'll get the special inspection in for the plywood nailing, and then after that it's going to be the final inspection. So in the interim, we can do some of the hardware, you know, like the L90s and the T-straps, that's not going to be obstructing anything. And then at the end, I think we're going to put the hurricane ties in to each of these joists. And then we'll be pretty much done. So that's it for now. Thanks very much. Bye.